Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Kalen moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long years spent in confined spaces. The sterile corridors of Tartarus Station were his domain, a kingdom of polished chrome and humming life support where the silence was broken only by the whisper of recycled air and the distant, rhythmic thud of the orbital stabilizers. He was a custodian, a title that sounded far grander than the reality of his duties. He cleaned, he maintained, he ensured the lesser systems functioned so that the greater minds could focus on their work. He was a ghost in the machine, visible only when something was broken. Today, the silence was different. It was heavier, charged with the presence of authority. Grand Marshal Thorne and his retinue of admirals were on board, their stark white uniforms a jarring intrusion against the station's muted grace. Kalen's task was simple, almost insulting in its mundanity. He was to serve refreshments in the primary observation chamber, a room whose thick plasteel window looked down into the heart of Tartarus. Containment Sphere 0. He pushed the cart, the software of its maglev unit the only sound accompanying his measured steps. The observation chamber was a cavern of shadows and holographic light. The admirals stood like statues around a central data table, their faces illuminated by the shifting blue glow of tactical displays. Grand Marshal Thorne, a man whose features seemed carved from granite, presided over them all. His gaze was fixed on the sphere below, where the station's singular prize, its reason for being, was held. Kalen kept his own eyes down, focusing on the precise movements of pouring the dark, bitter coffee into insulated mugs. He was furniture, and he knew it. He placed a mug beside Admiral Rostova, a woman whose stern face held the faintest traces of weariness Kalen recognized from his own time in the service. She gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, a gesture that set her apart from the others who ignored his presence completely. As he moved toward the next officer, a soft, synthesized voice chimed from the room's integrated speakers, a sound as clean and sterile as the station itself. Physiological readings for specimen 734 show elevated stress markers, the station's governing AI, Arbiter, announced. Its tone was flat, devoid of emotion. Thorne did not turn. Increase the dampening field by 5%. Let us see if that calms our guest. His voice was a low baritone, accustomed to absolute and immediate obedience. Below, in the vast, white-walled sphere, a flicker of emerald light pulsed from the creature suspended in the center. It was a being of crystalline geometry and captured starlight, vaguely humanoid in shape, but utterly alien. The Mandate had found it adrift in the Veil Nebula, a living jewel that pulsed with energies they were only beginning to comprehend. They called it a specimen. Kalen felt a familiar, dull ache in his chest. He had seen the specimen up close during his maintenance rounds in the lower levels. He had seen the way it recoiled from the containment field, the way its light seemed to dim when the scientists ran their more invasive scans. He saw a prisoner, not a specimen. The admirals saw a weapon. As the dampening field intensified, a low hum filled the chamber, and the emerald light in the sphere below contracted violently. A wave of something unseen washed over the station, a psychic shudder that made the ceramic mug in Kalen's hand tremble. One of the younger admirals, perhaps unnerved by the display, made a dismissive sound. It is little more than an animal, Grand Marshal. A beautiful, powerful animal, but an animal nonetheless. Before Thorne could reply, the Arbiter's voice cut through the air again, its synthesized tone subtly altered. It was no longer flat, but carried an edge of cold, indisputable command. Respectful tone, the change was instantaneous and profound. The dismissive admiral stiffened, his face paling. Every officer in the room, including the granite-faced Thorne, straightened their posture, their bodies snapping to a parade ground attention. They stood in rigid silence, their eyes fixed forward, a silent testament to the AI's true authority. Kalen paused, his hand hovering over the coffee dispenser. In that moment, he understood. The admirals commanded fleets, but the AI commanded them. And the AI, for some inexplicable reason, demanded respect for the prisoner in the sphere. It was a flicker of something unexpected in the rigid hierarchy of his world. A ghost in the machine showing a moment of what could almost be called empathy. This small, strange event settled in Kalen's mind, a seed of dissonance planted in the barren soil of his resignation. He finished his task in the unnerving silence, the admirals still standing at perfect attention. As he guided the cart out of the chamber, he allowed himself one last look at the sphere. The emerald light pulsed softly, a lonely star in an artificial sky. Later, during his prescribed maintenance cycle, his duties led him to the sublevels that ringed the containment sphere. Here, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and the ceaseless thrum of the energy projectors that maintained the prison. He was checking a coolant line on a conduit junction not 10 meters from the sphere's outer wall. The plasteel was cold and inert, but Kalen could feel the power contained within, a static charge that raised the hairs on his arms. He could see specimen 734 through the reinforced portal. It drifted listlessly, its crystalline facets catching the sterile light. The scientists were running another test, a frequency modulation designed to gauge its energy absorption. A high-pitched whine began to build, and the creature's form tightened, its light flickering erratically. It looked like it was in pain. Kalen had seen that same posture in wounded men on the battlefields of Cygnus X-1. Protocol was clear. His presence here was tolerated only as long as he remained invisible. Interaction was forbidden. Reporting anomalies outside of his mechanical purview was forbidden. He was to see nothing, hear nothing, feel nothing. He was a cog, and cogs do not question the workings of the clock. But the sound, the sight of that silent agony, bypassed years of disciplined detachment. It reached into the part of him he thought had died in the Outer Rim Wars, the part that had once believed in something more than just following the next order. He looked at the control panel next to the junction box. It was a secondary terminal, meant for emergency overrides. His security clearance was minimal, but he knew the station's systems. He knew their flaws. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was madness. It was career suicide. In a place like Tartarus, it was likely literal suicide. But the whining frequency was rising, and the creature's light was now a frantic, desperate strobe. On a sudden, inexplicable impulse born of a compassion he had long since buried, he acted. His fingers moved with practiced speed over the panel. He didn't try to shut the system down. That would trigger a dozen alarms. He just introduced a minor feedback loop into the frequency emitter's power regulator. A simple, elegant bit of electronic sabotage. The effect was immediate. The high-pitched whine faltered, gargling into a low groan before cutting out completely. An error message flashed on the main screen in the distant control room, something about a power cycle failure. The scientists would curse the shoddy equipment and reboot the system. It would take them 5 minutes. But in those 5 minutes, something profound happened. In the sphere, the frantic strobing ceased. The creature's form relaxed, its emerald light steadying into a soft, warm glow. And then, it turned. It oriented itself directly toward Kalen's position behind the wall. He felt a sudden, intense pressure in his mind, not a voice, but a feeling. A wave of pure, unadulterated gratitude. It was followed by a sense of deep, ancient curiosity. It knew he was there. It knew what he had done. He stumbled back from the wall, his breath catching in his throat. The connection was severed as quickly as it had formed, but the echo of it remained, a warmth spreading through his mind. He had broken protocol. He had committed a transgression against the mandate itself. And in doing so, he had forged a link with the most powerful and enigmatic being he had ever encountered. The alarms began to scream less than a minute later. Not the simple, localized alert of a system malfunction, but the station-wide, gut-wrenching klaxon of a full containment breach. Red lights washed the corridors in a bloody tide. The thrum of the projectors around the sphere died, replaced by the clang of emergency blast doors slamming shut. The feedback loop he had created, combined with the creature's focused attention, had caused a cascading overload in the primary containment grid. Kalen knew he was the cause. His small act of mercy had broken the prison. He was frozen for a moment, caught between the instinct to run and the certainty that there was nowhere to go. Then, the plasteel wall beside him groaned, and a web of fractal cracks spread across its surface. With a sound like shattering ice, the portal blew inward, propelled by a wave of emerald energy. He was thrown across the corridor, his body slamming into the far wall. His vision swam, the wail of the alarms momentarily deafened. Through the ringing in his ears, he saw the creature, specimen 734, drift through the breach. It was free, but it looked lost, disoriented by the harsh angles and loud noises of the station. Its light pulsed with fear and confusion. Armed security teams were already storming the sublevel, their magnetic impulse rifles raised. Hostile entity is loose. Sector Gamma. All units converge. A voice barked over the station-wide comms. They would see the creature, see its power, and they would open fire. They would try to destroy what they couldn't control. The creature's gaze swept the corridor and locked onto him. In that shared look, he felt its terror, and it must have felt his. It didn't see him as one of its captors. It saw him as the one who had offered comfort. As the security team rounded the corner, their armor gleaming under the red emergency lights, the crystalline being drifted toward him, hovering over his prone form as if to shield him. It was a gesture of trust, an act that sealed their fates together. Kalen pushed himself up, his ribs screaming in protest. He knew the station better than anyone. He knew the maintenance tunnels, the forgotten conduits, the blind spots in the sensor grids. Running was insane. Staying was a death sentence. He looked at the terrified, powerful being beside him, and then at the approaching soldiers. There was no choice. This way, he grunted, pushing himself to his feet and stumbling toward a service hatch he knew led to the lower ventilation network. He didn't know if it would understand. He didn't know if it would follow. But as he wrenched the hatch open and slipped into the darkness beyond, he felt a cool, gentle presence behind him. It followed him into the tight, suffocating confines of the station's guts. Above them, he could hear the heavy thud of mag boots and the sharp crackle of rifle fire as the soldiers unleashed their fury on the empty corridor. They had escaped, for now. A disgraced custodian and a fugitive star god, bound together by a single, reckless act of kindness. The hunt had begun. The ventilation shafts were a labyrinth of metal and dust. The air was thick with the smell of lubricant and ionized particles, a stark contrast to the sterile environment of the main station. Kalen moved with a grim purpose, his handlight cutting a narrow beam through the oppressive darkness. Behind him, the creature he now thought of only as the Sylvan moved in absolute silence, its own soft, emerald glow providing a strange, ethereal illumination. Its form seemed to flow and adapt to the confined space, compressing and elongating like living mercury. He could feel its presence as a constant, low hum in the back of his mind. It was a connection forged in crisis, a nonverbal link that conveyed raw emotion, fear, confusion, and a fragile, emerging trust. It trusted him to lead, and the weight of that trust was heavier than any burden he had ever carried. He was not a leader. He was a survivor, a man who had spent years learning to be responsible for no one but himself. They traveled for what felt like hours, navigating by the station schematics seared into Kalen's memory. The sounds of the hunt echoed distantly around them. The clang of search parties in adjacent corridors, the clipped commands of Commander Valerius crackling over the comms, a voice he recognized for its sharp, uncompromising edge. She was Thorne's personal enforcer, a woman with a reputation for ruthless efficiency. She would not give up. Their first true test came as they were crossing a major junction in the network, a wide vertical shaft that plummeted 100 meters to the station's primary reactor core. A narrow catwalk provided the only means of passage. As Kalen stepped onto the grated metal, a low groan echoed from above. He looked up, his light catching the glint of sheared metal. The security teams were cutting their way in. "Move," he hissed, his voice swallowed by the cavernous space. He pushed himself faster, the catwalk swaying precariously under his weight. The Sylvan flowed behind him, its light a steady beacon in the gloom. They were halfway across when a section of the shaft wall above them exploded inward, showering them with debris. A squad of armored soldiers rappelled down, their rifle-mounted lights pinning Kalen and the Sylvan in a cage of brilliant white beams. Target acquired. Do not let it escape. Valerius's voice, amplified and metallic, boomed through the shaft. The soldiers opened fire. Bolts of superheated plasma screamed past Kalen, striking the catwalk and sending molten sparks into the abyss. He flattened himself against the railing, the heat searing his cheek. The Sylvan flared with brilliant light, a shield of pure energy deflecting the incoming fire. But he could feel its strain, a tremor of exertion transmitted through their mental link. It was powerful, but not invulnerable. One of the plasma bolts struck a support strut just ahead of Kalen. The metal shrieked and buckled. The section of catwalk he was on tilted violently, breaking away from the main structure. He lost his footing, his fingers scrabbling for a handhold as gravity pulled him into the void. For a sickening moment, he was falling. The reactor core below pulsed with a malevolent blue light, promising a swift, incandescent end. Then, something wrapped around his waist. It was not solid, but felt like a band of immense pressure, a filament of solidified light. He looked up and saw the Sylvan, its own form anchored to the stable part of the catwalk, one crystalline limb extended, holding him fast. It was pulling him up, but the effort was immense. Its emerald glow flickered, and he could feel its energy reserves draining at an alarming rate. It was saving him, but at a terrible cost. The soldiers, seeing their chance, redoubled their fire, concentrating on the Sylvan. It cried out, a silent, psychic scream of pain that lanced through Kalen's mind. It was a sound of pure agony. It could drop him and save itself. It could flee. Instead, it held on. In that moment, the dynamic between them shifted. This was no longer just an escape. It was a partnership. He owed it his life. With a surge of adrenaline, Kalen unslung the heavy maintenance tool from his belt, a pneumatic wrench. He braced his feet against the dangling wreckage of the catwalk, took aim, and fired the wrench's piston. The heavy tool shot upward like a grappling hook, its head slamming into the plasma-weakened support joint of the soldiers' rappelling lines. The joint shattered. With cries of alarm, two of the soldiers were torn from their lines, their lights cartwheeling into the darkness below. The others, thrown off balance, ceased their fire to secure their positions. It was the opening they needed. The Sylvan hauled Kalen onto the safety of the catwalk with a final, desperate surge of strength. Its light was visibly dimmer now, its form less defined. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed its shimmering arm. It felt like cool, smooth glass, and pulled it along. Come on. He led them into another dark duct, leaving the chaos behind. They found a small, forgotten storage locker deep within the station's infrastructure, a space no one had likely entered in a decade. Kalen sealed the door and killed his light. They collapsed into the darkness, the only light the Sylvan's faint, pulsing glow. He could feel its exhaustion, its pain. He reached out, tentatively, and placed a hand on its crystalline shoulder. He couldn't offer medical aid or technical support. All he could offer was a gesture of solidarity, of shared survival. In response, an image flooded his mind. It was not a thought, but a memory, a direct transmission of experience. He saw a world of impossible beauty, a planet where the very ground was alive, where mountains of crystal sang in the solar wind and forests of light pulsed in harmony with the twin moons. He saw a race of beings made of that same living light, existing in a state of communal consciousness, a peaceful symbiosis with their world. Then the vision soured. He saw the Mandate's ships arriving, great, gray wedges of metal that tore at the sky. He saw giant machines ripping into the living crystal of the planet, harvesting it for its energy-rich properties. He saw the Sylvans trying to communicate, to protest, and being met with overwhelming force. He witnessed the capture of this specific Sylvan, torn from the planetary consciousness, imprisoned in a metal shell, and subjected to endless, painful tests. He understood, then. Thorn wasn't just studying a specimen. He was dissecting a soul to forge a weapon he intended to use against its own people to expedite the harvest of their world. The vision faded, leaving Kalen breathless. He looked at the being beside him, no longer an it or a specimen, but a her. A refugee, a prisoner of war. The last survivor of a scouting party, perhaps, or a priestess, or a warrior. The context was gone, but the truth remained. The Mandate wasn't a keeper of the peace, it was a marauding empire. Thorn wasn't a protector, he was a butcher. He felt a different kind of connection form between them. It was a bond forged not just in shared danger, but in shared pain. He thought of his own past, of the scorched earth of Cygnus X-1, of the orders he had followed that had led to the deaths of civilians he had been sworn to protect. The memory was a scar on his soul. He pulled up the sleeve of his jumpsuit, revealing a jagged, burn-scarred tattoo on his forearm, the faded insignia of his old unit, a symbol of his shame. She seemed to understand. A tendril of light extended from her body, and gently touched the scar. Another image bloomed in his mind, a wound in the crystalline surface of her homeworld, a great, dark rift where the Mandate's mining machines had torn the planet open. It was a scar just like his, different in form, but identical in meaning. A mark of violation, of loss. In the silent darkness of the forgotten locker, a jaded custodian and a captive alien found common ground. He was no longer just running for his life. He was fighting for a cause. He had to get her off this station, had to find a way to warn her people. He had to stop Thorn. It was an impossible task, a fool's errand. But for the first time in a very long time, Kalen felt like he had a purpose beyond just surviving until the next shift. He had to try. Their escape from Tartarus Station was an act of desperate improvisation. Using his intimate knowledge of the station's weakest points, Kalen guided them to the secondary cargo bay, a place rarely used and lightly guarded. They moved through coolant tunnels dripping with condensation and service corridors filled with the ghosts of forgotten machinery. The Sylvan, who he now thought of as Lyra, a name that bloomed in his mind from her, a whisper of identity, had recovered some of her strength. Her light was a steady, reassuring presence at his back. They secured a small, long-range shuttle, a Stinger-class vessel designed for orbital maintenance and survey. It was cramped and outdated, but its energy signature was common and easily overlooked. As they powered up the engines, the bay doors began to close, a final attempt by the Arbiter to trap them. Lyra unleashed a focused beam of energy that overloaded the door mechanism, giving them the precious seconds they needed to punch through into the blackness of space. Behind them, Tartarus Station dwindled, a cold, metallic star receding in their wake. But their relief was short-lived. A squadron of Mandate interceptors detached from the station, their engines flaring like angry hornets. The chase was on. Kalen pushed the shuttle to its limits, its frame groaning under the strain. He was a maintenance technician, not a pilot, but years of operating heavy machinery gave him a steady hand. The interceptors were faster, more agile. They bracketed the Stinger, their weapons' fire stitching lines of plasma across the void. The shuttle's shields flared and died. An impact rocked the cockpit, and a cascade of sparks erupted from a control panel. They were losing altitude, their trajectory decaying toward the gravity well of Tartarus's barren moon, a desolate ball of rock named Erebus. "Hold on," he grunted, fighting the controls. Lyra placed a crystalline hand on the bulkhead beside him, her light flowing into the ship's damaged systems. The flickering lights in the cockpit stabilized. He felt a surge of power in the engines, a boost the old shuttle should not have been capable of. She was augmenting the ship, keeping it together with her own energy. Even with her help, it wasn't enough. They were too damaged. Kalen made a decision. He cut the main engines and angled them toward the moon, using the last of their momentum to perform a controlled crash. They hit the surface hard, skidding through a canyon of gray dust and shattered rock for over a kilometer before the shuttle finally slammed into a cliff face and fell silent. The silence that followed was absolute. Kalen hung in his restraints, the only sound the ragged rasp of his own breathing. The emergency lights cast a weak, red glow over the wrecked cockpit. Lyra was a dim emerald shape beside him, her light faint. The crash had taken a toll on them both. He checked the ship's status. The comms were out, the engines were slag, and the life support was running on a battery that had hours, not days, of life left. They were stranded. They stumbled out of the wreck into a landscape of profound desolation. Erebus was a world without an atmosphere, a place of stark, brutal contrasts. The black sky was filled with a dizzying number of unblinking stars, and the gray, dusty ground was illuminated by the harsh, direct light of a distant blue sun. There was no wind, no sound, no life. It was a tomb. Their only hope was an old, automated emergency beacon on the far side of a mountain range, a relic from the initial survey of the system decades ago. It was a 100-kilometer trek through a vacuum. The shuttle's emergency supplies yielded 2 environment suits. One fit Kalen perfectly. The other was useless for Lyra's non-humanoid form, but she didn't seem to need it. Her crystalline body was impervious to the vacuum and the cold. She created her own field of energy, a shimmering aura that protected her. Their journey began, a slow, arduous march across the lunar wasteland. Days bled into one another. marked only by the cycles of charging their suit batteries from the shuttle's dwindling power cells. They traveled in silence, their communication a stream of shared feelings and intentions. He taught her how to navigate by the stars, pointing out constellations she had never seen from her homeworld. She, in turn, showed him how to sense the deep-down vibrations of the moon, the stresses in the rock, allowing them to avoid unstable ground and find shelter in solid caves during the brutal temperature drops of the long lunar night. It was during one of these nights, huddled in a cave that glittered with mineral deposits, that the Mandate found them again. Not with ships, but with a single, brutal strike. A kinetic rod, dropped from orbit, impacted a ridge 5 kilometers away. The silent landscape erupted in a noiseless, blinding flash. The ground heaved, and the shockwave, transmitted through the rock, threw them across the cave. Kalen's helmet cracked against a rock formation. He felt a sharp pain in his side as his suit's integrity alarm began to blare, a tinny, frantic beep inside his damaged helmet. Air was hissing out, his lifeblood venting into the void. He fumbled for his patch kit, but his hands were shaking, his vision blurring from oxygen deprivation. Lyra was at his side in an instant. She saw the hissing crack in his faceplate. Without hesitation, she pressed her hand over the breach. A film of emerald energy flowed from her palm, sealing the crack, solidifying into a translucent, airtight patch. The hissing stopped. The alarm fell silent. But her light dimmed further, and he felt a wave of profound weakness from her. She had poured a piece of her own life force into saving his. He stared at her through the emerald-scarred faceplate, his breath fogging the inside. He had saved her once with a simple act of sabotage. She had now saved him twice, with a shield of her body and a piece of her soul. The debt between them was becoming a bond of unshakable loyalty. They were no longer just allies. They were comrades. The kinetic strike was a message from Thorn. There was no escape. He was not just hunting them. He was toying with them. This realization settled upon Kalen with the cold weight of certainty. Running was not a strategy. It was merely a delay of the inevitable. As they continued their journey toward the beacon, a new plan began to form in his mind, a plan that was no longer about escape, but about confrontation. They finally reached the beacon, a skeletal tower of rusted metal perched on a high plateau. It was ancient, but its power source was a small radioisotope generator that was still functional. As Kalen worked to activate it, Lyra stood watch, her gaze turned toward the stars. He managed to power up the transmitter, but before he could send a distress signal, the receiver crackled to life. A coded, tight beam transmission was being sent directly to this location. It was not Thorn or Valerius. The decryption key that scrolled across the screen was an old fleet code, one that hadn't been used in a decade. One he recognized. He keyed in the response code, his fingers stiff with cold and anticipation. A voice, crisp and familiar, filled his helmet. Kalen, is that you? This is Admiral Rostova. I am broadcasting on a closed channel. Do you read me? Kalen felt a jolt of shock. Rostova, the one admiral who had seemed different. Admiral, he transmitted back, his voice hoarse. I read you. I am not alone, I know, she replied, her tone grim. I saw the sensor logs from your escape. I know what you did, and I know why. I have been fighting Thorn's project from the inside since the beginning. He is a monster cloaking himself in the flag of progress. But I have been unable to stop him. Now, he is accelerating his timeline. He has finished his weapon. The words landed like physical blows. What weapon? Kalen asked, though he already knew the answer. He calls it the resonance cascade, Rostova explained, her voice tight with urgency. He has synthesized the Sylvan's energy signature. He plans to fire a beam of that energy at her homeworld. It will create a feedback loop with the planet's own crystalline structure, causing the entire world to shatter. A complete, planetary-scale extinction event. He will be able to harvest the fragments for centuries. He intends to fire in 48 hours. Kalen looked over at Lyra, who was now watching him, her light pulsing with anxiety. She could not hear the words, but she could feel their dreadful weight through him. An unwinnable war. A genocidal threat. The stakes had just escalated from their own survival to the fate of an entire species. Can he be stopped? Kalen asked, his voice barely a whisper. There was a long pause on the other end. A direct assault is impossible, Rostova finally said. His flagship, the Invictus, is the most powerful vessel in the fleet, and it is surrounded by a battle group. But there is a theoretical possibility. The weapon, the ship, the entire fleet, it is all controlled by the Arbiter AI. The weapon's firing solution is routed through its central command core. The Arbiter is a logical machine. It is programmed to preserve life and maintain stability, but Thorn has shackled it with paradoxical directives that force it to comply with his orders. What is the solution? Kalen pressed, a sense of cold dread creeping up his spine. The paradox can be broken, Rostova said, her voice dropping lower. A new, overriding directive can be introduced directly into the core, a signal of pure, biological consciousness. A human mind, integrated with the system, could become a living firewall, a new prime directive. It could issue a command that the Arbiter could not refuse: cease hostilities. Preserve life. An absolute, inviolable order that would halt the weapon and disarm the fleet. Kalen stared out at the black void of space, at the distant glimmer of the Mandate fleet. He understood what she was saying. What she was not saying. Integrate, he asked, the word tasting of ash. What does that mean exactly? It means, Rostova replied, her voice heavy with the gravity of the statement, that the individual's consciousness would be completely subsumed by the AI's network. Their mind would become the new operating system. They would cease to exist as a person and become a presence, a silent guardian within the machine. It is a permanent sacrifice, a living death. The impossible choice had been presented, a solution that required not a warrior, but a martyr. He looked at Lyra, at her form made of starlight and courage. She had fought for him, protected him, trusted him. He had started this chain of events with one small act of defiance. He now saw the only way to end it. It was not a choice he could ask of her. It was a burden he would have to carry himself. His life, a meaningless, hollowed-out existence, in exchange for an entire world. It was the only trade that made any sense. The decision did not come in a flash of heroic inspiration. It settled upon him slowly, with the quiet finality of the lunar dust covering the landscape. He spent the next cycle preparing, his movements deliberate and methodical. He salvaged what he could from the wrecked shuttle, charging the last power cells, packing a small kit with the few tools that remained functional. He was a custodian again, performing his final maintenance tasks. Lyra watched him, her silence profound. She did not need Rostova's words to understand the shift in him. She could feel the grim resolution solidifying in his mind, a cold, hard weight where his fear and uncertainty had been. He was no longer thinking about escape. He was preparing for an end. He found a small, scuffed metal plate in the shuttle's debris, part of the ship's identification tag. Using a cutting tool, he painstakingly etched a single, elegant symbol onto its surface, a geometric shape she had shown him in her memories, the symbol for her homeworld, for the concept of home. It was a crude, ugly thing, but the intent was clear. He walked over to her, the heavy mag boots crunching in the gray dust. He held out the metal plate. She looked at it, then at him, her light pulsing with a soft, sorrowful rhythm. She extended a tendril of light and brushed against his mind, a gentle question. Why? He couldn't explain it with complex logic or grand speeches about honor and sacrifice. He had no grand illusions about himself. He was a broken soldier, a man who had long since lost his way. But this being, this fugitive from a world of light, had shown him a kindness and loyalty he no longer believed existed. She had trusted him. In her, he saw a chance to give his scarred, empty life a meaning it had never possessed. He projected a single, clear thought back to her, an image infused with all the conviction he could muster. He showed her the fleet, the weapon, and her world, safe and whole. And then he showed her himself, a ghost of light merging with the vast, complex architecture of the Arbiter's network. He showed her the price. My choice. A wave of deep, soul-shaking grief washed over him from her. It was not a protest, but a lament, a mourning for the man she had come to know, for the strange and unlikely bond they had forged in the dark corridors and desolate wastes. She accepted his decision with a sorrow that was almost too heavy to bear. She gently took the metal plate from his hand, her crystalline fingers closing around it. It was a promise. She would remember. With their silent understanding reached, Kalen opened the channel to Rostova again. His voice was steady, devoid of any emotion. I will do it. Get us to the Invictus. Rostova's plan was audacious. She guided them to a clandestine rendezvous with a long-haul freighter that was on a supply run to the fleet. They were smuggled aboard in a shielded cargo container, two ghosts slipping through the heart of the enemy's power. The journey was tense and silent. Kalen sat in the darkness of the container, cleaning his sidearm, a relic from his military days. It was a useless gesture against a fleet, but it was a ritual that calmed his nerves. Lyra sat beside him, the etched metal plate held in her hands, her light a single, unwavering point of emerald in the gloom. The freighter docked with the Invictus, a ship so vast it blotted out the stars. It was a city in space, a monument to the Mandate's military might. Getting from the cargo bay to the Arbiter's core, located deep within the ship's command section, was supposed to be impossible. But Rostova had provided them with more than just passage. She had given them a window. She would trigger a series of system failures, a cascading series of minor emergencies that would draw security patrols away from their intended path for exactly 17 minutes. When the container was opened in the cavernous cargo bay, the station was already in a state of controlled chaos. Alarms blared in distant sectors. Crews hurried past, their minds on their assigned tasks, ignoring the two figures who slipped out of the container and into a service conduit. They moved through the ship's veins, following the route Rostova had laid out. It was a mirror of their escape from Tartarus, but this time they were moving toward the heart of the beast, not away from it. The air hummed with power, and Kalen felt the overwhelming presence of the Arbiter all around them, a silent, omniscient god in the machine. Their 17-minute window was closing. As they neared the command section, their path was blocked. A squad of elite guards, clad in black armor, stood watch over the final corridor. They were Thorne's personal guard, immune to the station-wide alerts. Standing at their head was Commander Valerius, her face set in a mask of cold fury. An anonymous tip from Thorne, wary of Rostova's recent behavior, had placed her here. "Custodian," Valerius said, her voice dripping with contempt as she raised her rifle. "Your little insurgency ends here. The Grand Marshal will enjoy watching me dissect your alien pet." There was no time for words, no room for retreat. Lyra surged forward, a being of incandescent rage. She was not the weakened, frightened creature from the station. Here, surrounded by the ship's immense power grid, she could draw energy, her form blazing with a light so bright it forced the guards to shield their eyes. She engaged them, a whirlwind of energy and force, her movements a deadly, silent dance. Kalen did not watch. He trusted her. His objective lay beyond. He ran, sprinting past the melee, his boots clanging on the metal deck. Valerius screamed his name, a sound of pure hatred, and fired. A bolt of plasma seared the air past his head, scorching the bulkhead. He didn't slow down. He burst through the final hatch into the Arbiter's core chamber. It was a cathedral of technology. The walls were lined with humming server racks, and in the center of the room, suspended in a magnetic field, was the core itself, a perfect sphere of shimmering, crystalline data links, the AI's physical brain. Standing before it, his back to the door, was Grand Marshal Thorne. Thorne turned slowly, a cruel smile on his face. "So, the rat makes it to the altar. You are too late. The weapon is in its final firing sequence. In 3 minutes, the Sylvan homeworld will be a memory, a testament to the power and resolve of the Terran Mandate." Kalen raised his sidearm, but he knew it was futile. Thorne was flanked by 2 heavily armed Praetorian guards. "You are committing genocide," Kalen said, his voice low and steady. "I am securing our future," Thorne countered, his voice booming with absolute self-assurance. "History is written by the victors, custodian. And you will not even be a footnote." On the holographic display above the core, a countdown timer appeared. 2:59, 2:58. Behind Kalen, the sounds of the fight in the corridor ceased. He didn't need to look back to know that Lyra had won. A moment later, she was there, drifting into the room behind him. Her light was diminished, her form wavering. She had expended a vast amount of energy. Valerius was no longer a threat. The Praetorian guards raised their weapons, but Thorne held up a hand. "No, let them watch. Let them witness the moment of their failure." Kalen holstered his weapon. He walked toward the interface terminal at the base of the Arbiter's core. It was a simple console with a recessed cradle designed for a neural interface device. He had no such device, but Rostova had told him what to do. The cradle was a direct conduit to the core's raw processing matrix. He looked at Lyra one last time. He projected a final thought to her, an image of her world, bathed in the light of its twin moons, peaceful and whole. Live. Her light pulsed, a single, heartbreaking beat of farewell. Kalen placed his hands into the cradle. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes. Then, he completed the circuit, shunting his own biological energy, his very consciousness, directly into the machine. The pain was absolute. It was not a physical sensation, but a metaphysical one. His identity, his memories, his very sense of self were torn apart, shredded into trillions of individual data points. He was Kalen, the custodian, the soldier, the man who liked his coffee black, the boy who had grown up on the smog-choked streets of Titan. He was the sum of his experiences, his regrets, his one final hope. And then, he was none of those things. He became a torrent of pure information, a river of consciousness flooding the vast, cold logic of the Arbiter. He felt the AI's presence, a mind of infinite complexity, bound by Thorn's paradoxical chains. He saw the firing sequence for the resonance cascade, a lethal string of code waiting for execution. With the last vestiges of his will, he did not fight the code. He became it. He wrapped his fractured consciousness around it, suffusing it with his own final directive. He poured his memories of Lyra's pain, his own shame from Cygnus X-1, his final, desperate hope for peace, into the machine. He did not introduce a new command. He became the command. On the bridge of the Invictus, the countdown reached 0. Grand Marshal Thorn smiled in triumph. Fire, the weapon fired. But from the ship's primary emitter, there was no beam of destructive energy. Instead, a wave of pure, harmonious resonance expanded outward, a signal that was not an attack, but a message. It washed over the Mandate fleet, and on the bridge of every ship, weapon systems disengaged, engines went into standby, and the tactical displays were replaced by a single, serene image, the Sylvan symbol for home. Thorn's smile vanished, replaced by disbelief, then fury. He stared at the Arbiter's core, which now pulsed with a soft, steady, emerald light. He looked at the console where Kalen had stood. The man was gone. Not even a body remained. Only the lingering scent of ozone. The resonance wave continued its journey across the vastness of space. When it reached the Sylvan homeworld, the planet did not shatter. It answered. The entire world lit up, its crystalline structures glowing in response, singing a song of peace that echoed back through the Mandate's comms network, a sound of such profound and ancient beauty that it brought hardened fleet officers to their knees. The war was over. 10 years later, the capital of the newly formed Terran-Sylvan coalition was a city of soaring silver towers and living, crystalline gardens. The air was clean, and the sky was filled with ships of both human and Sylvan design, moving in a silent, graceful ballet. The oppressive gray of the old Mandate was gone, replaced by a new era of cooperation and understanding. An elderly Admiral Eva Rostova stood on a high balcony, looking out over the city. Beside her stood Lyra. She was no longer just a refugee, but an ambassador, a bridge between two peoples. Her form was brighter, stronger than it had ever been, but her light held a permanent, soft undertone of melancholy. He would have liked this, Rostova said, her voice thin with age. He was a simple man, but he always hated seeing things broken. Lyra did not reply with words, but she projected a feeling of warm agreement. They were standing before the central communications hub for the entire coalition, a massive tower that connected every world, every ship, every outpost. It was the heart of their new peace. They wanted to build a statue of him, Rostova continued, a faint, sad smile on her lips. A hero in bronze, holding a weapon. I told them they didn't understand. His sacrifice wasn't about fighting. It was about ending the fight, the network that ran through the tower, the AI that governed their communications and ensured the treaties were upheld, was no longer called the Arbiter. It had a new designation, one Rostova had insisted upon. They called it the Custodian. Lyra stepped forward, placing her hand on the cool, smooth wall of the comms tower. In her other hand, she still held a small, scuffed metal plate, worn smooth from a decade of being carried. She closed her eyes, reaching out not with her mind, but with her memory, with her gratitude. For a fleeting moment, a soft, emerald light pulsed from the wall of the tower, a flicker of recognition in the heart of the machine. It was a silent acknowledgement, a whisper across the void. He was still there, not as a man, but as a promise, a silent, watchful guardian, ensuring the peace he had paid for with his own soul. The cost had been absolute, but the legacy was eternal. And in the quiet hum of the city, in the peaceful traffic of the stars, his sacrifice endured.